make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Heavenly Homeland, a 5-part audio documentary from the Faithful Politics podcast that looks at the impact of Christian nationalism in America. I'm your host, Will Wright.
You can call us extremists. You can call us domestic terrorists. You know who else was called a lot of names his whole life? Jesus.
I'm a Christian and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church.
So much for this myth of separation of church and state.
When you look at our platform, it's the only platform out there that recognizes the Creator, that recognizes that we have rights that supersede government.
We need people all over the country to be willing to put on that full armor of God, to stand firm against the left schemes. You'll be met with flaming arrows, but the shield of faith will stop them.
In America, the complex interplay between faith and politics has always been a topic of deep fascination for me. From the doctrine of discovery, which empowered monarchs to claim non-Christian lands, to the powerful, biblically infused oratory of Martin Luther King Jr.
I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land.
Our nation's history is rich with examples of faith influencing events. Your perspective on whether the interplay of faith and politics is a good or bad thing might vary widely, shaped by your upbringing, political beliefs, and religious traditions. This intricate dance between religion and the American ethos has profoundly influenced our national narrative. The First Amendment, with its promise of religious freedom, has nurtured a diverse landscape of beliefs and non-beliefs. Yet, it has also sparked controversies such as the Scopes monkey trials clash over evolution in education.
John Scopes, a young teacher of Tennessee, had taught, contrary to state law, Darwin's theory of evolution.
And ongoing debates about religion's place in public schools.
Number 468, Stephen I. Engel et al. Petitioners versus William J. Vitale, Jr. et al.
Among these intersections of faith and politics, perhaps no topic has stirred more interest across academic circles, political arenas, and church congregations than Christian nationalism. But what is Christian nationalism? This concept that has woven itself so deeply into our discussions about politics and religion? Why does it matter? This series aims to unpack these questions. We'll delve into the many aspects of this ideology, guided by insights from some of the nation's foremost experts on the subject, many of whom have been guests on our flagship podcast, Faithful Politics. Before we dive deeper, let's start with a fundamental inquiry that lays the groundwork for our entire exploration. What exactly is Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's good to start with definitions.
Meet Brian Kaylor, an acclaimed author and journalist, currently leading as president and editor-in-chief at Word&Way. Brian's work delves deeply into the intersection of faith and politics, a theme he explores thoroughly in his podcast, Dangerous Dogma.
I think the easiest way to think about Christian nationalism is this is an ideology that confuses and conflates our Christian faith and our national identity. And that would be possible in any country, but we'll stay focused on the context of the United States. One, because that's obviously where we are. And two, I think it's more significant of a problem when you're dealing with a large empire type power. Right. I mean, so like if you're a Christian in Moldova or something, it's, Christian nationalism isn't as dangerous, I think, because there's not as much of a geopolitical threat then that can infect the faith. And so it's this idea that to be a real American, you must be a Christian. And the flip of that, to be a good Christian, you also have to be a good American. And I think that that is a very dangerous ideology, both for our democracy, but it's also, and I'm more concerned even on this side, for our faith. And, you know, it is something that I have written about for years. I mean, I know a lot of people have talked about Christian nationalism since January 6th, but it's a real thing that has existed before that. And I and many others were naming it as Christian nationalism before January 6th. And I think that's important because some people are saying, oh, y'all are just making this up. This is just a way to, you know, to attack Trump and January 6th and all that kind of stuff. But Christian nationalism was a real thing that we were talking about before that.
Why is it so crucial to grasp the significance of this intersection? Well, the answer lies in compelling statistics. A significant study by the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI for short, in collaboration with the Brookings Institute, aimed to unravel the impact of Christian nationalism on American democracy and culture. The findings were as eye-opening as they were expected. Here to shed light on these findings is Robbie Jones, the president and founder of PRRI.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the first things we have to do is you have to get the definition of it. I mean, so so this is a public opinion survey that we conducted again with the Brookings Institution, and so it's a fairly large survey. And what we did is we basically had about a dozen questions that measured various kinds of sentiments like that. At the end of the day, we settled on 5 questions that really hang together, or 5 statements that really hang together. And by hanging together, I mean, like statistically, we can measure that they're highly correlated with one another. So if you answer one way on one of these questions, you're very likely to answer a similar way on one of the other ones. So out of the dozen or so that we tested, these 5 tend to kind of coalesce into kind of one group. And so we use these as a kind of a kind of amalgamation or joint measure of Christian nationalism. So I'll just read you the statements real quickly so you get a sense of it. So these are all agree, disagree questions from the survey. So questions like, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. So it's those 5 questions that we made a composite measure. And then we looked at people who either strongly agreed with those or strongly disagreed, and people who were in the middle as well. And the top line finding that we found is that we found about 3 in 10 Americans who were either what we called Christian nationalism adherents or Christian nationalism sympathizers. So an adherent is one who strongly agreed with all of those questions. About 10% of the country fell into that category, that strongly agree with all of them. But another 19% of the country fell into the category of somewhat agreeing with those statements. So taken together, 10 plus 19, that's 29%, about 3 in 10 Americans who are either adherents or sympathizers. And so then we looked at the other side as well. On the far side, 29% of the country strongly disagreed with all of those statements. We call those rejectors. And then another 39% somewhat disagreed. We called them skeptics. So overall, about 3 in 10 who lean that direction, and about 2/3 who lean kind of the other direction away from affirming Christian nationalism.
In the show notes, you'll find a link to the full report that Robbie just discussed. It's a must-read for anyone interested in understanding Christian nationalism. This ideology intertwines Christian beliefs with national identity, portraying the United States as inherently a Christian nation, with its principles and institutions deeply rooted in Christian values. Its proponents often use this notion of a Christian-based America to support their political and policy agendas. Now, the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation isn't a new concept. It has origins and various historical interpretations. Proponents argue that the nation's founding fathers intended for the United States to be a Christian nation, with its institutions and legal frameworks built upon Christian principles. They often cite references to God and biblical phrases in historical documents like the Declaration of Independence and the writings of key figures such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to support their claims. However, it's crucial to recognize that the United States was not officially established as a Christian nation in terms of its government structure. Even if this were the case, the Constitution clearly prohibits the government from endorsing any specific religion and guarantees religious freedom for all citizens. We'll delve deeper into this in the next episode. The Founding Fathers, in fact, aimed to create a secular government that would safeguard religious freedom and prevent religious persecution. To offer more insight on this topic, we have Carté, an associate professor of history at Southern Methodist University, who specializes in early American and Atlantic history. She's also the author of Religion and the American Revolution, an imperial history.
Most of the people who were involved in framing the Constitution or in the break from Britain came from a background of a Protestant empire. So the British Empire was explicitly a Protestant empire. And when they went to found the United States, which happens, of course, in several stages, most of them associated organized religion with social stability. So the sense that the state would be stabilized by people who shared a religious background was something that they'd all been raised with. But then when it comes to actually do it, they realize that in the United States, religion is really divisive. And the different parts of the United States, of the early United States, have very different traditions. They're actively disagreeing with each other on a lot of things. They don't want any kind of stabilizing church. And in some ways they associated, the British establishment with kind of corruption, right? With, these fat bishops who would, ride around London and never go to their bishoprics and all that, this kind of stereotype that wasn't necessarily true, but that was the stereotype. And so they wanted to many of them wanted to move away from the idea of a single state church, but that left a hole of how are you going to accomplish the goals of state stability without an institution to do it. So I think when we see Christianity in the founding, or we see Protestantism in the founding, we see it with this kind of assumption that institutional religion will do that. And over time, after when there's no established church, other things have to come in and sort of fill that role, some of which is just rhetoric, right? You just have to be religious and that will make you a good citizen. And there's no guaranteeing that will happen. It's just kind of language. And then other kinds of, voluntary associations and things like that come into.
The perception of America as a Christian nation gained momentum in the 20th century with the rise of the Christian right, particularly during times of societal transition and cultural shifts. This idea has been employed by various factions and individuals aiming to assert their version of Christianity as the primary religious and cultural force in the nation. Here's Kristin Kobes Du Mez, historian and author of the book Jesus and John Wayne, to talk about the Christian influence we saw in the mid-1900s.
Yeah, so I'm a historian, so I'm going to bring you back a few decades, right? And what I realized is, this Cold War era was just really critical. And what we see happening in the late 40s, the early 50s is evangelicals, already in the early 40s say, we want to reassert ourselves in terms of influencing American culture. They felt somewhat marginalized after the fundamentalist modernist controversies, and they came together in the National Association of Evangelicals and had a plan. They wanted to reassert their influence through Christian publishing, through Christian magazines, through radio, and they felt that they had a special role to play. And particularly by the end of the 40s, in light of the Cold War, they knew that they had a role to play to protect Christian America, because they perceived themselves to be the most faithful Christians, and they saw that Christian America was under threat. And communists were anti-God, they were anti-family, and they were anti-American. So all the things that evangelicals held dear. And so it was the role of evangelicals to kind of shore things up. And the threat was a military one, and so you needed a strong military defense, and you needed strong men to defend faith, family, and nation. Now, the thing is, at that time, it wasn't that unique. Evangelicals were aligned with many other Americans, especially white middle-class Americans. This was Cold War consensus. This was the post-war, baby boom. Traditional family values were in. And all that changed in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you have the civil rights movement, incredibly disruptive, particularly to Southern white evangelicals. You have the feminist movement starting up, right, challenging traditional gender roles. And you have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement challenging American goodness and greatness. And all of these things lead many Americans to question these kind of traditional values. And that's when evangelicals really double down on all of these things. And they understand how they're connected. You need strong men. Gender difference becomes hugely important during this time. Like femininity and masculinity are opposites. Men and women are different in every cell of their bodies. And it's up to men to be strong, to be ruthless, to be aggressive. And God made them that way, filled them with testosterone so that they can defend faith, family, and nation. But the feminists are coming after them and the anti-war activists. And, we can talk race too. And what the solution to kind of all of these kind of intrusions and disruptions to the status quo is the assertion of white patriarchal authority. And that really moves to the center of conservative evangelical identity, and it is an oppositional identity by the 1970s, right? The sense of we are the faithful remnant here. Too many other Americans are abandoning these values, and we have this special role to play to protect and defend these core values. And by asserting and defending white patriarchal authority, that's how it's done.
Supporters of Christian nationalism often use the idea of America's Christian heritage to advocate for policies that align with their religious beliefs. This includes efforts to introduce prayer in public schools, display religious symbols in public spaces, or create laws based on specific religious moral values. It's important to point out, though, that the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation isn't something everyone agrees on. Historians, legal experts, and many politicians often challenge this view. However, it's interesting to note that a lot of religious leaders, especially those from the religious right, really buy into this idea. They often preach about it to their congregations, reinforcing the notion of America's Christian roots. A great example of this is a sermon by Southern Baptist pastor Robert Jeffress, which I think really brings this point home.
Some messages bear repeating, especially in the times in which we live. We are living in historic times right now. And over the last several weeks, we've seen the Supreme Court of the United States issue some monumental decisions, not only affecting abortion and the sanctity of life, but in the last 2 weeks, there have been 2 specific rulings regarding religious liberty. And this is my carnal side speaking. I've loved seeing the liberals' heads exploding, literally, over these rulings, just going crazy. And you hear things like, the Supreme Court, they're taking us backwards. They're taking us backwards. Well, in a sense, they're right. They are taking us back to our founding fathers' original intentions, especially when it comes to the relationship between faith and public life. And that's why today we're going to revisit a truth that I don't think can be taught often enough. In fact, there's a controversy right now in Florida about the attempt to teach this true version of American history about the founders' relationship to faith in our country. If you listen long enough to this pagan atheist group like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Americans for Separation of Church and State, if you listen to them long enough, you will become convinced that the bedrock principle for the founding of our nation was this belief that government should be neutral. Translate that, hostile to all things religious, especially Christian religions. They tell us that this nation was founded by, maybe a few Christians, but also a lot of deists, a lot of atheists, and they were all secularists who wanted to found this nation apart from any Christian influence whatsoever. In fact, we're told the founders wanted to build this unscalable wall that would keep any spiritual influence from seeping out of the church into the public life. Well, that version of American history belongs right up there with the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. It is a complete myth. As we're going to discover today, America was founded primarily by Christians who believed that the future success of our nation depended upon our fidelity to God and His Word. And though it's politically incorrect to say it, we can say with great historical evidence to support it that America was founded as a Christian nation. And we're never going to stop apologizing for saying such a thing.
Despite the substantial impact of religion, especially Christianity, in molding American society and its historical narrative, the Founding Fathers consciously set up a secular government. This system facilitates the harmonious existence of varied religious beliefs and safeguards individual liberties in matters of religion. Let's hear from Professor Carté once more.
I think the people who founded the country, who are, elite white men, right? Those people were invested in social stability that they saw as having in the past come from Protestantism. But they were very concerned that they did not think an established church would be effective in the United States. They eliminated tests for public office. That was a little bit controversial. There were people who said, in the ratification process, people who said, what if a Catholic is elected president? Clearly, that will be the downfall of the United States. But the Constitution explicitly eliminates tests for religious tests for public office, right? So they had this background, but they chose not to use it. They chose to leave religion out, and they kind of developed the idea that religion would be something private. The phrase that Thomas Jefferson uses and Madison uses this kind of language too is that religion is something between a person and their God. Of course, he uses gendered language, but that it's a private spiritual thing, right? It's a thing of thought or a thing of feeling, not a thing of institutions. So when you transition religion into being something that's just kind of private, you can protect it like we do in the First Amendment, but without saying that the citizenry must be Protestant or Christian or anything else, or even religious, right? Or saying that the leaders of the government need to be religious. So I wouldn't say that the institutions of government are founded as for a Christian or a Protestant nation. But I would say that the people who did that founding were nervous about the institutional transition they were doing.
For a lot of the folks who support or consider themselves Christian nationalists, the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation is a pretty huge deal. It influences everything from how they vote to the politicians they support, and even how far they'll go to defend their Christian values. I mean, the very thought of challenging the notion about America's purported Christian roots would be tantamount to blasphemy, and for some, even unpatriotic. Remember that PRRI survey Robbie Jones talked about earlier? It showed that 77% of the hardcore believers in Christian nationalism think Christianity, or being Christian, is key to being truly American. A whopping 84% believe that if the U.S. strays from its Christian roots, we're basically not going to have a country anymore. And 81% think that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Now keep in mind, these numbers don't reflect all Christians, just the ones really into this movement. So why is there such a big difference in opinion, even among other Christians? Well, a lot of it comes down to how people interpret the Bible, which is what biblical hermeneutics is all about. It's the study of how to understand the Bible's text, their context, and what it actually all means. To get a better grip on how biblical hermeneutics plays into Christian nationalism, we're bringing in Dr. Tremper Longman III. He's an emeritus professor of biblical studies and a distinguished scholar of biblical studies at Westmont College. He's a big name in the Bible world. He's one of the lead translators of the New Living Translation and has helped out with other popular translations like The Message, the New Century Version, and the Homeland Standard Bible. Let's hear what he has to say.
The most important point I would make is that people who are Christian nationalists, they are acting on a fundamental hermeneutical error, which is the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So in the Old Testament, there is a godly nation chosen by God, namely Israel. But in the New Testament, the people of God are not a nation. It is a church drawn from many different nations and ethnicities. So the idea of a Christian nation is an oxymoron in a New Testament time period. Recently read a book, I forget the title of it. It was basically on how the founding fathers used the Bible in their thinking. And my reaction after reading it is they were really bad Bible readers. Christian nationalism, is the idea that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and they're different shades of that, by the way. But the most pernicious type of Christian nationalism is the one that would say that the law of the United States ought to reflect the law of the Bible.
The intersection of biblical hermeneutics with Christian nationalism becomes apparent when adherents of Christian nationalism selectively construe biblical verses to back nationalistic ideologies or political objectives. They may perceive their nation as chosen or blessed by God and aspire to instate policies and practices that align with their interpretation of biblical tenets. Christian nationalism can also employ hermeneutics to validate political actions, thereby shaping their understanding of their duties as Christians within the political domain. Nevertheless, not all Christians interpret the Bible in this manner, and interpretations differ among traditions and denominations. For instance, some interpretations of the Bible prevent women from preaching, while others place strict guidelines on what a person should wear. And well, some interpretations allow whatever this is.
What I wouldn't give, I'd pay folded money to sit in the halls of Congress, hold a Bible in my hand. When Nancy Pelosi addresses me before the nation, what I wouldn't give on national TV to stand up and tell that wicked Jezebel, sex trafficking mongrel, baby butchering demon exactly what I think about her. I'm telling you, we better get loud, church. I said we better get loud. We better get bold. We ain't got time to stop. We ain't got time to back up. You waiting on me, you going the wrong way. I'm moving forward for the gospel. I ain't bowing down and kissing the ring. There's only one set of feet I bow at, and it's Jesus' feet. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant, who was made in the likeness of men.
So this question, right, of demonic possession and how that fits with partisan and political identity coming from a diagnosis of somebody like this, the pastor Greg Locke, is super interesting historically, and I talk about some of this in the chapter of my book on evangelical politics and specifically on progressive evangelical identity.
This is Isaac Sharp, visiting assistant professor of theological studies and author of the book The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out.
So one of the things that happens in the course of the 20th century, I end up arguing, is that evangelical identity, what it means to be evangelical, gets really closely aligned and tied to politics and to a particular kind of politics and a particular partisan politics, such that by the dawn of the 21st century, to be evangelical in common association is to be Republican Christian, right? Like this is part of what happens. Such that somebody like Greg Locke making this suggestion that somebody who is a Democrat is demon-possessed is actually building on a history of that kind of rhetoric from certain kinds of political leaders. So, for instance, in that chapter that the evangelical politics chapter, one of the ways that I recount the story of how that happened, how this evangelical identity gets so tied to partisan politics, is the longer arc of the story begins with the rise of a progressive kind of evangelical politics, and the story that I recount in that chapter is how those folks got absolutely sidelined and marginalized by the rise of the religious right. One of the things that I argue in that chapter, though, is that one of the most effective ways rhetorically that certain kinds of evangelical leaders cast aspersions and marginalized progressive evangelical figures is through this rhetoric around what it means to be an evangelical, right? So you get this example that I use in the chapter from Jerry Falwell, right? So Jerry Falwell is talking about, there's a couple of instances in interviews over the years where he's talking about Jim Wallace. So Jim Wallace historically came on the scene as this progressive evangelical figure who was saying, I am an evangelical and I vote for progressive political positions. And you get this thing that happens over the years where with the rise of the religious right and Jerry Falwell as one of the figures, Jerry Falwell in interviews says things across the years, says things such as, quote, that Jim Wallace is as evangelical as an oak tree, which is like this, it's kind of silly, like what does that even mean? But it's you get the point, right? He's making an argument through this attack on Jim Wallace's faith because of his politics. And then in another interview later on, Falwell does something similar in a conversation with Jim Wallace where he's like, yeah, well, you can basically see whether or not Jim Wallace is a real evangelical, and here's how we'll do it, right? Who did you vote for in the last 3 or 4 elections, right? And just list them off. And because Jim Wallace did not vote the way Jerry Falwell thought he should, Falwell's point was that means that Jim Wallace is not really an evangelical. So you get this kind of rhetoric built in evangelical spaces across the last several decades where that's a kind of a common move to suggest that if somebody's voting for Democrats or if somebody's not a Republican or if somebody's supporting progressive politics, obviously they can't be a real Christian. So this the Pastor Locke is actually building on a tradition that has been going on for a couple of decades that I do talk a little bit about in the book.
Christian nationalism isn't just some highbrow term tossed around by academics or politicians. It's a real thing that affects how a lot of people vote, pray, and even how they interpret and read their own Bibles. But here's what's really cool about America. It's all about diversity. We've got a whole spectrum of thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations. Whether you're totally on board with what you're hearing or it's making you scratch your head, remember, what we're sharing here is just a tiny piece of a much bigger picture. So make sure you check out the full interviews with our guest today. You'll find all the links in the show notes, grab their books, dive a bit deeper into this topic they've spent their entire lives exploring. And hey, don't forget to catch our next episode, where we're going to tackle the whole idea of separation between church and state. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. See you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our regular podcast, Faithful Politics, where a Democrat and a conservative pastor talk with authors, scholars, politicians, and journalists about topics related to faith, politics, and the intersection of the two. To learn more, please visit www.faithfulpolitics.us.